I would like to thank Christine for the good work that she is doing, and were it not because of her resilience and commitment and strong belief in the work that she does, I certainly would not be here. I should have gone back to the US on May 31st. So thank you very much. I wanted to be a little bit deviant. As you must realize, we in the US are not as disciplined and orderly as the British people are. So I wanted to sit where I was and then do my talk. And then I realized that the cameras may not be as kind to me as the people. My PhD dissertation at the University of Michigan, it's on the First World War in Cameroon. And so if you would like to know details about the First World War in Cameroon, you are welcome to read my PhD dissertation. If you Google my name at any time, it will pop up. You see my email. If you have difficulties accessing it, please send me an email, and I will send you a copy. I was going to start hoping that there would be the map of Cameroon. Unfortunately, we don't have it, so I would like for us to visualize the map of Cameroon in our mind's eye. Unfortunately, the previous speakers have shown us the African map and so on. And so Cameroon straddles the Central and West African region. And Cameroon has been turned upside down since the start of the First World War in 1914. And so that is the reason I elected that I was going to have my talk fit squarely into the theme of this conference, which is legacies of conflict, colonial legacies of conflict in Africa, and how the ongoing problems that Africa is having have their roots from colonialism and the First World War, to be precise. In November 2016, a young man in the English-speaking part of Cameroon carried an empty coffin on his head, then marched on the streets with a coffin, demonstrating what then and now it's known as the Cameroon Anglophone minority problem. Soon after the coffin incident, Cameroon Anglophone lawyers demonstrated, then the teachers, and then the entire Anglophone Cameroonians. The Cameroon government's response to the protest, as usual, was inflammatory, transforming the situation into a conundrum. The Anglophone minority problem in Cameroon is what the English-speaking people consider to be their increased marginalization by the Francophone majority since 1961. Bedeviling the social, economic, and political history of the country in particularly pathetic ways, the problem should be a cause for humanity everywhere, including here, of course, in the United Kingdom. From a humanitarian standpoint, the problem has resulted in numerous agonies. Teenage university girls have been brutalized, raped, and killed by the men in uniform under the dictatorial regime of Paul Biya, who has been in power since 1982. On 28 November, for example, uniformed men flooded the Anglo-Saxon University of Boya, then moved on to invade students' residential homes, committing unbelievable atrocities. A 17-year-old girl by name Mado Eyong was raped, ended up in the hospital, and then died. Several others have been lynched or even murdered by the regime. Presently, the majority of the Anglophone leaders have been jailed. The government cut off internet facilities for the Anglophone section of the country for several months until international pressure blended with internal forces compelled the government recently to budge. Indeed, Cameroon is politically intractable. Although I am not a futurologist, history teaches me, and should teach all of us here, that if care is not taken, it would not be long before Cameroon degenerated into a maelstrom of a political bloodbath. The question, and really the question, is how did Cameroon get to this point? This now brings me squarely to the crux of my talk. My talk showcases how this problem owes its origin to the European involvement of Africa in the First World War, and more especially to the British policies in the Cameroons between 1916 and 1961. I am going to do this in 3 stages. Stage 1, during World War I from 1914 to 1919. Stage 2, during the time of the first part of the British administration of the Cameroons from 1922 to 1959. And then the third stage, it's gonna be from 1959 to 1961, during the clamoring for independence. I must note that this may not be a very popular talk, at least not on this subject, not here, not now. But I want to make it clear that today's generation cannot be held accountable for the history that was made yesterday. And the good news is, my talk is about that history that was made yesterday. The making of the problem. The making of the present-day Cameroon Anglophone minority problem followed 3 stages, as I just mentioned. Stage 1, the First World War and the partition of Cameroon. When war broke out in 1914, Cameroon then was a German colony. German diplomatic pleas that hostilities not be extended to African colonies fell on deaf ears, as a joint Anglo-French force with its black African soldiers invaded Cameroon in September 1914. The Germans and the African soldiers resisted the Allied invasion for 18 months, but the resistance crumbled like a pack of cards by February 1916. The fall of Cameroon into the hands of Britain and France excited the then British Prime Minister, Asquith, to declare in the British Parliament on 15 February 1916 that the First World War in Cameroon was one of the most satisfactory and complete episodes so far in the history of the Great War. End quote. What next? Cameroon has been taken. The partition. The fall of Cameroon was one thing, its political future quite another. The majority Cameroonians had supported the Allied powers, hoping to have Britain as their new colonial master after the war. This, of course, was not to be. In invading the Cameroons, the British agenda had more to do with strategies and covetousness of territory elsewhere in East Africa, as Anne just mentioned, than adding what the British saw at the time as another worthless West African territory to the British African Empire. Thus, once Cameroon was conquered, diplomat Sir Lancelot Oliphant, representing then the Foreign Secretary Grey, met with his French counterpart Georges Picot in February 1916 to partition Cameroon. Oliphant presented Picot with a small-scale map of Cameroon, and using a pencil in a casual way, the two of them drew lines across the map to partition an entire territory. Oliphant himself described the arbitrary partition as follows. I laid out the map of Cameroon and asked Picot what part of the Cameroon French would like to take, supposing I was in a position to meet their wishes. It never dawned on Peacock that he could ask for the whole of Cameroon, end quote. The partition gave Britain a mere 1/5 portion of Cameroon, which was bordering Nigeria, and then it left France with the lion's share, which was 4/5. At the start of the war, Cameroon measured over 300,000 square miles, more than the size of Germany and Britain combined. At the end of the war, over 100,000 was sliced, given to French Equatorial Africa, and what was left was about 190,000. The part that the French took was about 160,000 square miles, and the one that the British took was about 34,000 square miles. The British and the French claimed to concerned Cameroonians that the 1916 partition was provisional. The Douala people were particularly offended by being placed under the French. Some even migrated to the parts of the Cameroon that were placed under the British. Several petitions were written. Even British traders in the Cameroon petitioned the Foreign Secretary that the natives of Africa and Cameroon should at any rate be consulted as to their future government and protection. In March 1916, Joseph Bell, an influential prince of the royal family in Douala, petitioned Prime Minister Lord George that if the intention of seizing Cameroon from the Germans was to deliver Cameroonians to the French, then clearly they had moved Cameroon from the frying pan to the fire. Lord Lugard, then the Governor General of British colonial Nigeria, had earlier criticized the arbitrary partition as an act of betrayal. All opposition, however, came to naught, and in July 1919, British and the French representatives finalized the partition, splitting many ethnicities and tribes between British and French portions. Nigerian newspapers harangued the finalization. For example, the Lagos Standard on August 13, 1919, attacked what it called the hypocrisy of the British relations with Africans, stating that the British share in the disposal of the late German colonies without the previous consent of the peoples concerned filled all Africans with painful displeasure. The paper insisted that European powers who claimed to create a new world order of peace and harmony had no justification for deciding for Africans what they thought Africans deserved. The newspaper's diatribe on the European manner of the disposal of Cameroon colony was yet to produce no effect. It was just a cry over some spilled milk. Instead, a British colonial official during the 1919 peace conference sarcastically stated, and I quote, "We cannot hope to take into the British sphere all the people in the world who would doubtless like to be within the British Empire." That's stage one of the problem. The British and the French have bifurcated the territory, splitting people apart. Now, stage two of the creation of the problem. And this stage, it's the time of British administration from 1922 to 1959. The 1/5 portion of the British Cameroons was administered from 1922 as a mandated territory of the League of Nations. Although the British were required to lead the people through basic social, economic, and political developments, this did not happen. Instead, the British further balkanized the British Cameroons into British Southern Cameroons and British Northern Cameroons, administering them as an integral part of Nigeria. The consequences, of course, were that the British Cameroons limped behind basic developments, unlike their Nigerian and French Cameroon counterparts. The underdevelopment of the British Cameroons was such that up to 1940s, there was not a single post-primary school in the territory. And until about 1953, there did not exist a single political party in the British Cameroons. Although the statutes of the British Cameroons had changed after 1945, from a League of Nations mandate to a United Nations trusteeship, which set higher goals for development towards self-rule, things continued to stagnate. Only from 1959 did things speed up, and the road to independence was fast-tracked. Stage 3 of the problem, the nature of independence. 1959 to 1961. Great Britain finally institutes the minority statutes. From 1959, things move fast in the British Cameroons. As the British prepared to grant independence to Nigeria by 1961, British Cameroon's politicians had to make tough political choices. The British decision to administer the Cameroons as an integral part of Nigeria and the desire to have that part of the Cameroons permanently integrated into Nigeria had created acrimonious political contestations. And the British Cameroon's politicians and the people were divided between three key things: integration, cessation, and reunification. Integration meant that British Cameroons would have to achieve independence by joining permanently with Nigeria. Cessation, on the other hand, meant that British Cameroons would want to cut off from Nigeria and achieve independence as a country on its own. Reunification, finally, required them to achieve independence by joining with the other part that had been given to the French in 1916. Although the most popular choice wanted by the people and some of the leading politicians was cessation, the British and the United Nations forced two choices on the people, leaving out the only choice that the people desperately wanted. British Cameroonians were forced to vote in a plebiscite in 1961 to achieve independence on only two conditions. That is, by either integrating with Nigeria or by reunifying with former French Cameroon. As had been the case during the partition of Cameroon in 1916, all attempts by the people of British Cameroons to have the British and the United Nations allow them achieve independence through cessation as an independent Cameroon fell on deaf ears. The result was that the British Southern Cameroons was forced to achieve independence by reunifying with the much larger former French Cameroon. This is how the English-speaking Cameroonians came to constitute a great minority in today's Cameroon. A British plebiscite officer by name John Percival, he died probably I think 10 years ago, who had been sent to the Cameroons to supervise a plebiscite and who worked in one of the areas, drove home the point that Britain violated the political and moral rights of British Cameroonians. The sheer arrogance of this enterprise still takes my breath away. In no way was Britain qualified to impose such a process on British Cameroonians, who made it quite clear to me and to the British that they wanted no part of it, and that they saw the whole thing as a sham, a cosmetic exercise in democracy. The only decision they were allowed to make was to choose whether to throw in their lot with Nigeria or with French Cameroon, and they wanted neither of them. All the other decisions had been taken thousands of miles away by officials in London who thought they knew for Africans better than what Africans knew for themselves. End quote. Now, let me conclude. In the making of the Cameroon Anglophone problem, there were better choices or paths that the British could have followed. I would like to conclude this talk by summarizing the different historical paths and choices denied the people of Cameroon by the British, the consequence of which eventually created the present-day problem that I began this talk with, in which people are dying. And then there are potentials of a bloodbath. So let me give the paths and the choices that were denied the people. The first historical path which the British denied Cameroonians was to use the occasion of the First World War to seize the territory from the Germans in 1916. Otherwise, the country would have eventually achieved independence as one unified former German colony. The second path was making sure that a larger part of Cameroon after World War I did not fall under British rule at a time when the British clearly were capable of doing otherwise. The third was the neglect of the British Southern Cameroons, making it to attain independence and reunification in 1961 from a position of weakness. The fourth, the final, and indeed the last straw on the camel's back, was denying the British Cameroons the choice of choosing to achieve independence as a nation in itself, and forcing upon them only two choices of either integrating with Nigeria or reunifying with the larger French Cameroon. And the result was that they reunified, and today they are fighting. They are on each other's throat, they are killing each other, and nobody knows what is going to happen next. Ladies and gentlemen, I have now come to the end of my talk. Thank you very much for your kind attention.